The courtroom was packed with whispers and anticipation, the air thick with tension. Everyone had gathered to witness the high-profile trial, but no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. At the front, Senator John Kennedy sat with an aura of authority, his stern yet composed demeanor unshakable. The case was intense, but it wasn't the trial itself that was drawing all the attention. It was the tension between Kennedy and the detective who had been called to testify, Detective James Carter, a man known for his no-nonsense approach to policing, had been on the force for years. But as soon as he entered the courtroom, his eyes locked onto Kennedy and a cold smirk spread across his face. Kennedy had always been a figure of power, but Carter had a disdain for people like him, the political elites who didn't understand the real world he came from. His eyes betrayed a deep-rooted prejudice, one that had remained hidden until now. Kennedy had worked for years to fight for justice, equality, and the rights of the oppressed, but he knew that this wasn't just another day in court. It was personal. He had faced racism before, but nothing like this. Nothing so blatant and out in the open. As the case progressed, Carter's attitude grew more apparent. The words he spoke dripped with condescension, and his actions spoke volumes. He mocked the very idea of justice, dismissing the importance of the trial and showing an unshakable belief in his superiority. The tension in the room was palpable, and even the judge seemed wary of confronting him. It wasn't until the moment came, when the detective was asked a question that struck a nerve, that things took a dark turn. Carter, trying to make Kennedy look like a fool, sneered at him, his words laced with racism. "Senator Kennedy," Carter spat, "you're a man of words, but can you actually do something that matters? Maybe you should try your hand at something real, like our talent show next week. I'm sure you'd be just as useless there as you are in this courtroom." A gasp echoed through the room. The crowd fell silent and all eyes turned to Kennedy. His face remained impassive, but inside a storm was brewing. He had been insulted publicly, his worth questioned in front of a packed courtroom. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Kennedy stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Carter. His voice was calm, but the underlying fury was unmistakable. "You think I'm useless, Detective?" Kennedy said, his voice carrying through the room. "Well, let's see who's really useless here." In that moment, the crowd was left in stunned silence. The detective's smirk faltered, replaced with confusion. He hadn't expected this. But Kennedy wasn't done. He had just been publicly humiliated, but he wasn't going to back down. He turned to the judge, his voice unwavering. Challenge accepted. John Kennedy's rise to power had been anything but ordinary. He wasn't born into wealth or privilege, and he hadn't always been the polished politician the world saw today. Raised in the small, humid town of Zachary, Louisiana, Kennedy knew what it was like to fight for respect. His parents, hard-working and humble, taught him the value of dignity, something he held dear through every victory and failure. But Kennedy wasn't always a hero. In his younger years, he was quiet, reserved, and often the target of bullies. It was a part of his past he rarely talked about, but it shaped him in ways that few could understand. The small, timid boy who had been the butt of every joke had slowly evolved into a man who wouldn't tolerate injustice, no matter where it came from. He had become a lawyer first, fighting for those who couldn't defend themselves, and then a senator, where he battled not just for laws but for lives. Over the years, Kennedy had earned a reputation for being an unyielding force for justice. Yet beneath the success and the speeches, there lingered the ghosts of the past, the times when his name didn't carry the weight it did now, when he was just another face in the crowd. And then there was the detective, James Carter. Carter had never been the type of man who would hide his biases. Those who worked with him knew he was a relic of an older, uglier time, and it was no secret that his views were deeply flawed. But Carter had power, and power came with respect. He had seen Kennedy rise through the ranks, but he didn't care about the man's moral convictions or his fight for equality. To Carter, Kennedy was just another politician, a man who spoke a lot but had no idea what it was like to live in the real world. It wasn't just the fact that Carter was a racist. It was the way he used his position to wield that prejudice like a weapon. He had seen Kennedy's speeches, heard his promises for change, but in his mind, men like Kennedy were out of touch. They didn't understand the struggles of the common man, the very people Carter was sworn to protect. Carter had grown up in a small, working-class family in Baton Rouge, but his upbringing had been marred by bitterness. His father, a disgraced officer, had often vented his frustrations on him, teaching him to mistrust anyone who didn't look or think the way he did. Over the years, Carter's hatred had festered, turning into something more dangerous, something that would eventually cost him everything. Kennedy had heard the rumors about Carter. Everyone in the courthouse had. The whispers about his unchecked racism, the way he treated minorities with contempt. But Kennedy had never allowed himself to stoop to the level of his enemies. He had focused on the job at hand, getting justice for the innocent and dismantling the systems of corruption that had plagued his state for decades. Still, there was something about Carter's presence that unsettled him. When Carter entered the courtroom that day, it wasn't just a confrontation with a fellow public servant. It was a confrontation with everything he had worked to overcome in his own life. He had faced discrimination before, but never like this, not so blatant, so raw. Carter's actions in the courtroom weren't just a challenge to Kennedy's authority. They were a direct assault on everything Kennedy believed in. But Kennedy was no stranger to fighting battles. He had fought for his voice when no one had listened. He had fought for his place in the world when others tried to silence him. And now, he found himself on the front lines once again, not just for himself, but for the people who had always been overlooked, just like he had been in the past. As Kennedy sat there, the memories of his own struggles, of his own hidden past, flooded back to him. The feeling of being an outsider. The weight of silence in the face of injustice. He had fought too long and too hard to let someone like Carter take that away from him. And yet, as the detective's words lingered in the air, Kennedy knew that this wasn't just about a personal vendetta. This wasn't just about a slap in the face. It was bigger than that. It was a battle for the soul of the country, for the future of every person who had ever been told they weren't enough. With his eyes fixed on Carter, Kennedy made a decision. This fight would be his. Not just for him, but for the people who had been silenced by hatred and prejudice for far too long. John Kennedy's rise to power had been nothing short of remarkable. But behind his polished speeches and commanding presence lay a past filled with quiet struggles and painful memories. He wasn't born into wealth or privilege. Raised in the small town of Zachary, Louisiana, Kennedy had always known what it was like to fight for his place in the world. His parents, hardworking and humble, taught him the value of respect, the kind that wasn't given because of titles or wealth, but earned through action. Kennedy's childhood was shaped by the rough edges of rural Louisiana. While many kids in the area spent their days fishing and playing sports, Kennedy spent most of his time reading and dreaming of a life that wasn't bound by the limitations of his small town. But those dreams weren't without their obstacles. He was never the most popular kid in school, never the one with the fancy car or the loud laugh that drew attention. No, Kennedy was the quiet, bookish type, the one who always seemed to be in the background. And for a long time, that suited him just fine. But as he grew older, he realized something. The world wasn't as welcoming to people like him. People who didn't come from money, people who didn't have the right connections. He learned early on that his voice didn't matter unless he fought for it. He saw the prejudice that ran deep in the community, the way people with darker skin or different accents were treated as less than, as outsiders. It wasn't just the kids at school who mocked him. It was the system itself, the police, the courts, the schools. Everything was rigged in favor of those who already had power. And Kennedy, despite his intelligence and drive, was always seen as an outsider. His decision to become a lawyer wasn't just about pursuing a career. It was about fighting for people like him, for those whose voices were silenced before they could even speak. It was a path that led him from Zachary's small courthouse to the halls of Washington, D.C. But even as a senator, Kennedy never forgot where he came from. The fight for justice wasn't just political for him, it was deeply personal. He had spent his life battling the same systems of power that tried to keep him down as a boy, and now as a politician he was trying to dismantle those very systems. But not everyone in the political arena shared his values. Detective James Carter had been with the Baton Rouge Police Department for over 2 decades, a man of power and authority. On the surface, he appeared to be everything a detective should be, sharp, tough, and unwavering. But beneath that exterior lay something darker. Carter was known for his no-nonsense attitude, but it wasn't just his professionalism that people feared. It was his unhidden racism. In a town where racial tensions ran high, Carter was a relic of a bygone era, one where people of color were still viewed as inferior, regardless of their contributions to society. Kennedy had heard the rumors about Carter. The detective was known for his biased views, his discriminatory practices, and his general disdain for anyone who didn't fit into his narrow worldview. But what Kennedy didn't know was that Carter's hatred for people like him, people who had succeeded despite the system, was something much deeper than political differences. It was rooted in years of bitterness and personal failure. Carter grew up in a household filled with anger and resentment. His father, a disgraced former officer, had instilled in him the belief that people like Kennedy were the problem. He saw Kennedy's success as a direct insult to everything he had been taught. It didn't help that Kennedy had risen to power by championing causes that Carter found meaningless: racial equality, criminal justice reform, and a more inclusive future. To Carter, Kennedy was a symbol of everything he hated: the successful elite, the people who looked down on him, the ones who didn't understand what it was like to live a life grounded in reality. And so, when Kennedy walked into that courtroom, he wasn't just another politician. He was the embodiment of everything Carter despised. The detective saw Kennedy's calm demeanor as weakness, his moral high ground as a threat. Carter was used to intimidating people with his forceful presence, but with Kennedy, things were different. Kennedy's presence wasn't something that could be dismissed. It was the quiet strength of someone who had earned their place not by exploiting others, but by using his voice to fight for justice. The first time Carter laid eyes on Kennedy, he felt a pang of jealousy. It wasn't just the fact that Kennedy was a senator. It was the way people looked at him, the way he commanded respect without demanding it. It infuriated Carter, who had spent his life fighting for recognition in a system that never truly valued him. As the trial progressed, Carter's animosity toward Kennedy grew. His insults were subtle at first, mocking his speeches, making jokes about his political career. But as Kennedy's patience wore thin, so did Carter's facade. The detective's jabs became more pointed, more personal, and finally, when Kennedy stood up to answer a question, Carter snapped. In front of the entire courtroom, he insulted Kennedy's dignity and mocked him, knowing full well that Kennedy had no choice but to take it. But Kennedy wasn't the same man he had been as a child. He wasn't the boy who cowered in the face of bullies. He wasn't the quiet lawyer who had to fight for every inch of ground. No, Kennedy was now a man who had lived through his own demons and had the scars to prove it. And as Carter's words echoed in the courtroom, Kennedy felt a surge of something deep inside him, something old, something raw. He could feel the weight of his past bearing down on him, but he wasn't afraid anymore. This was his fight. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The air was thick with the whispers of onlookers, their phones poised to capture whatever spectacle was about to unfold. As Detective James Carter stood with his arms crossed, his smirk never left his face. It was a smug, condescending expression, as if he knew something everyone else didn't. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to wield his power over others, but today was different. Today he was facing someone who wasn't afraid of him, someone who had faced far worse than Carter's taunts and still stood tall. John Kennedy sat quietly at the defense table, his expression calm but his mind racing. He had seen prejudice before, he had felt it. As a child, he had been labeled the outsider, the one who didn't belong. But now, in the midst of this charged moment, Kennedy felt the weight of his own journey. The oppressive environment of the courtroom, the sneering face of Detective Carter, it all brought him back to his roots. Back to the boy who had spent so many years trying to prove himself in a world that never seemed to want him. Carter had always been a man who felt entitled. He had spent his entire career bullying those beneath him, throwing his weight around with a sense of superiority. He had always been able to get away with it. Until now. Kennedy was no ordinary target. He wasn't a man to be pushed around or insulted without consequences. But Kennedy wasn't going to confront Carter in the way the detective expected. He wasn't going to lash out in anger or attempt to escalate the situation. Instead, Kennedy chose to let the moment breathe. The silence hung between them, thick with the unspoken words. Carter's taunts had only grown louder, but Kennedy's demeanor remained unwavering. The detective's voice echoed in the room, his mockery dripping from every word, trying to provoke the senator, trying to get him to react. "Come on, Senator," Carter sneered. Tell me, what do you know about real people? I mean, you're up there making speeches, but you couldn't handle a real job like we do. Bet you can't even keep up with something simple like our talent show next week. Or are you too busy playing politician? The words hung in the air, sharp and stinging. The audience held its breath, waiting for Kennedy to snap, to defend his dignity. But instead, Kennedy's lips curled into a slight smile, a quiet, knowing smile. He wasn't playing Carter's game. Real people, Detective? Kennedy asked, his voice smooth, deliberate. Let me tell you something. Real people don't hide behind their badges and their power. They stand up for what's right, even when it costs them. But it seems you've forgotten what it means to do the right thing. Carter's expression faltered for a split second, his bravado slipping. He hadn't expected Kennedy to take the high road. He had assumed that, like everyone else, Kennedy would cower, would shrink under the weight of his insults. But that didn't happen. Kennedy's calm, controlled demeanor was like a mirror reflecting back Carter's own insecurities. The room was silent, but it wasn't the calm before a storm. It was the calm after a storm had already passed, after the damage had been done and the pieces were starting to fall into place. Carter, the man who had always used his position to silence others, had underestimated Kennedy in the worst way possible. He had thought the senator was just a smooth talker, a politician with no real substance. But now Carter was starting to realize that Kennedy wasn't just a man with power. He was a man with conviction. And let me guess, Kennedy continued, his tone soft but firm. You think I'll just back down, don't you? That I'll let you get away with this? But you're wrong, Detective. You've underestimated me, and now you've got a choice to make. Carter's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching towards his belt as if to grab for his weapon. But Kennedy wasn't afraid. He had faced much worse than a man like Carter. He had faced people who tried to break him, to silence him. He had fought against the system that was rigged to keep people like him down. And here he was, standing in front of a racist detective who thought he could intimidate him. You think I'm afraid of you? Kennedy asked, his voice rising slightly. I've spent my life fighting for what's right. You think I'm going to let someone like you ruin everything I've worked for? You think I'm going to let you drag me down to your level? Carter's face reddened with rage, but Kennedy's words hung in the air, piercing through the facade of control the detective had carefully constructed over the years. Carter's anger was tangible now, but it wasn't the same kind of power he was used to wielding. He was losing ground, and he knew it. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. It was clear that this wasn't just about a petty insult anymore. This was about something far deeper. It was about power, about justice, and about the way one man's hatred had the potential to destroy everything another man had fought to build. As the audience waited in rapt silence, Kennedy didn't give in to the moment's pressure. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze locked on Carter, his words carrying the weight of every struggle he had ever endured. I'm not just here to win a case. Detective, Kennedy said, his voice low and steady. I'm here to make sure people like you can't hurt anyone else again. You've made a choice today. You've decided who you are. Now I'll decide who I will be. With that, Kennedy stood tall, his eyes never leaving Carter's. He had made his point. The room was no longer in chaos, but it was charged with an energy that had shifted the power dynamic completely. Carter was no longer in control. The courtroom remained charged with a strange electricity, the air crackling with the tension of unspoken words. John Kennedy stood there unwavering, his posture tall and steady. His eyes remained locked on Detective James Carter, who was now visibly seething with anger. The audience, though quiet, could feel the shift. The power was no longer in the hands of the detective. It was now firmly with the senator, who had refused to be intimidated. Carter, however, was not the type to back down easily. His pride, built over years of being untouchable, had been shattered in mere moments. The senator's words had cut through him like a blade, and now he could feel the weight of his own mistakes beginning to bear down on him. The audience remained silent, watching the drama unfold, unsure of how it would play out. But deep down they all knew this wasn't just about the insult anymore. It had become something much bigger. Carter's eyes narrowed as he looked at Kennedy, his expression darkening. He had always been the one in control, the one who held the power. But now the realization was dawning on him. Kennedy wasn't just some politician. He was a man who had faced down adversity, someone who had fought for what was right and who wouldn't be brought down by a petty insult. But Carter was still a detective, and detectives had their ways. He could feel the heat of anger rising in his chest, and for a brief moment he considered using his badge, his position of power, to silence Kennedy once and for all. He had done it before, using his authority to manipulate situations to his advantage. But something about this was different. Kennedy's calm demeanor, his unwavering resolve, it was shaking Carter to his core. "Enough of this," Carter muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you're better than me, huh? You think you can stand there and lecture me like you've got all the answers?" Kennedy didn't flinch. He simply stared at Carter, his eyes filled with a calm determination. "I'm not lecturing you, detective. I'm showing you who you really are." The words hit Carter like a punch to the gut. For a moment he was silent, his mind racing as he tried to regain his composure. The crowd was still watching, waiting for something to happen. And then, in the dead silence that followed, Carter did something unexpected. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, glancing around the room, as if he were looking for an escape from the weight of his own shame. "I've been in this job too long to let a man like you make me feel small." Carter spat, his voice laced with venom. "You think you can intimidate me with your speeches and your high and mighty attitude? I've seen it all. I know how this game works." Kennedy's expression softened, his voice dropping to a more compassionate tone. "You think this is a game, detective? This isn't about power. This is about people, real people, who don't have the luxury of hiding behind a badge. You've built your life on lies and prejudice, and today, it's catching up to you." Carter's fist clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening as the words hit him harder than anything Kennedy could have done physically. For the first time, the detective felt exposed, vulnerable. The walls he had spent years building around himself, walls made of anger and arrogance, were crumbling. "You don't know me," Carter growled, his voice cracking slightly as his confidence faltered. "I know enough," Kennedy replied quietly. "I know that you've spent your life hiding behind hate, but today you don't get to hide anymore." A flicker of something dark passed across Carter's face. In that moment, Kennedy saw it, saw the man beneath the uniform. It wasn't strength or power that had kept Carter going for all these years. It was fear. Fear of being exposed for the fraud he was, for the lies he had built his life upon. Kennedy took a slow step forward, his eyes not leaving Carter's. "You were a child once, just like me. And when you were growing up, you had dreams. Dreams that weren't poisoned by hatred. But somewhere along the way, you let those dreams die, didn't you? You let anger and fear take over." Carter's expression faltered for the briefest of moments, and in that second, Kennedy struck. "It's not too late to change, detective. It's not too late to stop living in the shadows of your own bitterness." The detective's face hardened, his eyes flashing with something darker. Anger, regret, maybe even a hint of shame. He turned away from Kennedy, muttering something inaudible under his breath. Kennedy stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "You don't have to answer to me, Carter, but you will answer to yourself. And when that day comes, I hope you can live with the man you've become." The room was deathly silent as the weight of Kennedy's words settled in. The detective had been outmatched, outclassed not by power or prestige but by truth. Kennedy wasn't fighting to win this battle for himself. He was fighting for something far greater: justice, dignity, and the very soul of the people who had been silenced by men like Carter. As Carter turned his back on the senator, the realization that he had been exposed, his racism, his arrogance, began to sink in. It was only a matter of time before the public would know the truth. And there was no hiding from that. Kennedy's victory wasn't about humiliating Carter. It was about showing the world that true strength came from confronting your demons, not running from them. And as Carter walked away, head down, defeated, Kennedy knew that this was just the beginning. There was a long road ahead, but he had taken the first step. The days following the courtroom confrontation felt like a haze to John Kennedy. The media frenzy had reached a fever pitch, with news outlets speculating on the fallout from his public clash with Detective Carter. But despite the chaos swirling around him, Kennedy found himself alone with his thoughts, replaying the moment over and over. He had faced racism before in the halls of power and the streets of his hometown, but this was different. This wasn't just about one man's prejudice. It was about something deeper, something that resonated far beyond the walls of that courtroom. Kennedy had always believed in the power of change. He had spent his entire career fighting for justice, for equality, for the voices of those who had been silenced by the system. But as he sat at his desk staring out the window at the Louisiana landscape, he couldn't help but wonder, could he really change someone like Detective Carter? Could a man so entrenched in his own hate ever see the light? He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The stress was taking its toll. The weight of being both a senator and a symbol for justice had always been heavy, but now it felt unbearable. He had fought so hard for others, but now he realized that the battle wasn't just external, it was internal too. For the first time in a long time, Kennedy felt a flicker of doubt. As he sat in the silence of his office, a knock at the door broke his thoughts. Without waiting for a response, the door creaked open, and his assistant Lisa stepped inside. She had been working with him for years, always calm, always steady, but today her expression was different. She looked concerned. "Senator, there's something you need to see," Lisa said, holding up a folded piece of paper. She handed it to him, and Kennedy unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the words on the page. It was an anonymous letter, written in hastily scribbled handwriting. At first, Kennedy thought it was just another angry rant from a detractor, but as he read the words, his stomach twisted. "I saw what you did to Carter. You humiliated him in front of everyone, but you didn't know the whole story. Carter wasn't always like this. He was one of the good ones. Something happened to him, something that changed him forever. If you want to understand him, you need to hear the truth." The letter was signed simply, "A Friend." Kennedy sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had been so focused on confronting Carter's prejudice, on righting the wrongs in front of him, that he had never stopped to think about the deeper story. What had made Carter the man he was? What events had shaped him into someone capable of such hatred? The letter offered no answers, only questions. But it was enough to spark something inside Kennedy, a curiosity, a sense of responsibility. If he was going to confront the forces of injustice, he couldn't just do it on the surface. He had to understand the roots, the history, the pain that drove people like Carter to become who they were. The next day, Kennedy made the decision to visit Carter, to seek the truth behind the man's transformation. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew that this wasn't just about redemption for Carter. It was about understanding the forces that shaped them both. He arrived at the Baton Rouge Police Department early the next morning. As he walked through the sterile hallways, the cold, impersonal walls seemed to close in on him. This was Carter's world. This was where his power had been built, on intimidation, on control, on a system that rewarded prejudice. When Kennedy arrived at Carter's office, he knocked once, then stepped inside. The detective was sitting at his desk, his face a study of exhaustion and regret. Carter didn't look up at first, as if he hadn't expected anyone, least of all Kennedy, to be standing before him. "Detective," Kennedy said, his voice calm but firm, "I know you've been through a lot, and I know you're angry at me for what happened in the courtroom, but I need you to listen to me. There's something you need to understand about what's been driving you all these years." Carter finally lifted his eyes, locking with Kennedy's. For a moment, there was no animosity in his gaze, only something far worse. Guilt. "I didn't expect you to come here, Senator," Carter said quietly, his voice hoarse. "What do you want from me?" "I want to understand you," Kennedy replied, taking a seat across from him. "I want to know how you got to this point. I want to know why you chose hate over everything else." Carter's hands trembled slightly as he folded them together on his desk. "You don't get it, do you? You think I'm just some bigot who can't see beyond his own prejudice? But there's more to it than that. I didn't just wake up one day and decide to hate people. I had reasons, and those reasons shaped me into who I am today." Kennedy leaned forward, listening intently. "What happened, Carter? What changed you?" Carter's eyes flickered with something dark, something buried deep. "It wasn't always like this. I used to be better. I used to believe in justice, but then something happened. I lost my brother. He was a soldier, killed in a war nobody wanted to talk about. And when he came back, he was a different person. He had seen things that no one should ever see. But no one cared about him. No one wanted to understand what he went through. And when he came back, broken and haunted by his past, I couldn't help him. I couldn't save him. He fell through the cracks just like so many others." The words hung in the air, and for the first time Kennedy understood. Carter's anger wasn't just about race, it was about loss. It was about a man who had watched his own brother suffer and disappear, and who had been left to pick up the pieces without any real help. That kind of pain, that kind of disillusionment could warp a person. It could turn them bitter, could turn them into someone who saw the world in only black and white. "I'm sorry for what happened to your brother," Kennedy said softly, "but hate isn't the answer. I've been where you are. I've seen pain and I've lost people too. But you have to make a choice, detective. You can't let your past define your future. You don't have to keep carrying this hatred." Carter's gaze softened, and for the first time Kennedy saw a flicker of something. Regret, maybe, or a glimmer of hope. It was the beginning of something. Perhaps not a full redemption, but a chance for change. "I didn't expect you to come here, Senator," Carter said quietly, his voice hoarse. "What do you want from me?" "I want to understand you," Kennedy replied, taking a seat across from him. "I want to know how you got to this point. I want to know why you chose hate over everything else." Carter's hands trembled slightly as he folded them together on his desk. "You don't get it, do you? You think I'm just some bigot who can't see beyond his own prejudice? But there's more to it than that. I didn't just wake up one day and decide to hate people. I had reasons, and those reasons shaped me into who I am today." Kennedy leaned forward, listening intently. "What happened, Carter? What changed you?" Carter's eyes flickered with something dark, something buried deep. "It wasn't always like this. I used to be better. I used to believe in justice, but then something happened. I lost my brother. He was a soldier, killed in a war nobody wanted to talk about. And when he came back, he was a different person. He had seen things that no one should ever see. But no one cared about him. No one wanted to understand what he went through. And when he came back, broken and haunted by his past, I couldn't help him. I couldn't save him. He fell through the cracks just like so many others." The words hung in the air, and for the first time Kennedy understood. Carter's anger wasn't just about race, it was about loss. It was about a man who had watched his own brother suffer and disappear, and who had been left to pick up the pieces without any real help. That kind of pain, that kind of disillusionment could warp a person. It could turn them bitter, could turn them into someone who saw the world in only black and white. "I'm sorry for what happened to your brother," Kennedy said softly, "but hate isn't the answer. I've been where you are. I've seen pain and I've lost people too. But you have to make a choice, detective. You can't let your past define your future. You don't have to keep carrying this hatred." Carter's gaze softened, and for the first time Kennedy saw a flicker of something. Regret, maybe, or a glimmer of hope. It was the beginning of something, perhaps not a full redemption, but a chance for change. The days after their conversation were a blur for John Kennedy. He couldn't shake the weight of Carter's confession, the way the detective had revealed his own buried pain. For a man so entrenched in his beliefs, it had been a crack in his armor, one that spoke of a deep, unresolved grief. But Kennedy knew that just talking about it wasn't enough. Carter had to confront the truth, face it head on, and make a decision that would change his life forever. It was a quiet afternoon when the confrontation came. Kennedy had been preparing for his next public appearance, yet his mind kept drifting back to the detective. He couldn't help but wonder, had their conversation been enough to change him? Or was Carter just a man who was too far gone? The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Lisa, his assistant. "Senator, there's been an incident," she said, her voice urgent. "Carter's on the news. He's been involved in a violent altercation with a civilian. It's bad, John. The public is demanding answers." Kennedy's heart sank. He had feared this moment, the moment when Carter's demons would catch up to him. He had hoped the detective would make a choice to change, to make things right. But now it seemed like the situation was beyond repair. "I'll be right there," Kennedy replied, hanging up the phone. He knew what he had to do. The media storm was about to reach a boiling point, and Carter needed a lifeline. He wasn't going to let the detective drown, not without offering him one last chance. Kennedy arrived at the Baton Rouge Police Department within the hour, his face grim with resolve. As he stepped into the building, the tension in the air was palpable. Officers rushed back and forth, their eyes filled with worry. Carter was in a holding room, his demeanor shattered, his hands cuffed to a chair. The same arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow despair. He looked like a man who had lost everything: his job, his reputation, his sense of purpose. Kennedy entered the room quietly, his footsteps deliberate. The door creaked closed behind him, and Carter's head snapped up, his eyes flickering with something between guilt and fear. "What's going on, Detective?" Kennedy asked, his voice steady. He wasn't angry, but there was a deep disappointment in his tone. "What happened?" Carter's gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I lost it. It happened so fast. A civilian, a kid, he made a comment about my past. I snapped. I hit him. I didn't mean to, but I couldn't stop myself. I don't know what's wrong with me, Senator. I thought I had control over all this. Over my rage, over my hatred. But I don't. Kennedy felt a wave of compassion wash over him, but he didn't let it show on his face. No one is beyond redemption, Detective. But you have to make the choice to change. It's not going to be easy. You'll lose everything you've built if you don't take responsibility for what you've done. But this moment could be the turning point for you. Carter looked up at him, his eyes filled with tears for the first time. I don't know if I can come back from this, he whispered. I've ruined everything. The public won't forgive me. They'll tear me apart. Kennedy stepped closer, his voice calm but unwavering. They'll tear you apart if you let them. You can't let your past define you, Carter. The hate, the rage, it's not who you are. You have a chance to do something different, something meaningful, but you have to take it. Carter's breath hitched, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought, his mind swirling with the weight of his choices. The room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights above them. Kennedy could see the battle within Carter, the tug-of-war between pride and the shame that had consumed him for so long. Finally, Carter spoke, his voice hoarse. I don't know how to fix this. I've been living in my own bitterness for so long I don't even know where to start. Kennedy's face softened. You start by accepting responsibility. You start by doing the work, the hard, painful work. You have to look in the mirror and face yourself, and then you make amends. You start small, but you start. For a long moment, Carter said nothing. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, What if it's too late? What if I've already destroyed everything? Kennedy's response was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he had learned in his own journey. It's never too late, Detective. As long as you're breathing, it's never too late to make things right. The road ahead won't be easy, but that's the price of redemption. A long silence passed between them, and for the first time Kennedy saw the flicker of something in Carter's eyes. Something like hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A small spark in the midst of the darkness. As Kennedy turned to leave the room, he paused at the door. I'm not going to give up on you, Carter. But this is your fight now. You have to decide what kind of man you want to be. Carter didn't answer immediately, but Kennedy could feel the change in the air, the shift from despair to something more hopeful. It was subtle, but it was there. Kennedy left the room, but as he walked through the halls of the police station, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. This was what he had always believed in, that people could change. That no matter how far gone someone seemed, there was always a chance for redemption. But as he walked out of the building and into the cool Louisiana night, he knew this was just the beginning. Carter had taken the first step, but the true test of his transformation was yet to come. The weeks following the incident were a whirlwind for both John Kennedy and Detective James Carter. The media coverage was relentless, the public's opinion shifting with each new development. Kennedy had been right. Redemption was not a simple process. But it wasn't just about the media's judgment or public opinion. It was about what was happening within Carter and the way he was starting to change. For Carter, the journey had begun in earnest. The first few days were the hardest. He faced not only the legal consequences of his actions but also the crushing weight of his own guilt. He had been suspended from the police force pending an investigation, and the fallout from his public altercation was widespread. But there was something different about the way he approached this situation. This time he wasn't running away from the consequences. This time he was standing tall, ready to face the truth. Kennedy, for his part, had stayed out of the spotlight. He had done what he could for Carter, offering his guidance and support from the sidelines. It wasn't his place to dictate Carter's path, but Kennedy was determined to show him the way forward, not just in the courtroom, but in his personal life as well. They had talked several times since their conversation in the holding room, each meeting another step toward change. Kennedy had given Carter the tools he needed to rebuild his life, but Carter had to be the one to put them into practice. One rainy afternoon, Kennedy received a phone call that changed everything. Carter was standing at the doorstep of a press conference surrounded by reporters. The detective had requested the meeting himself, and Kennedy was curious. What was he planning? When Kennedy arrived at the press conference, Carter was already there, standing at a podium with his head held high. The room was filled with reporters, cameras flashing, their questions quick and pointed. It was clear that Carter had come to this moment with a purpose, and it wasn't just to save face. He was here to own up to his mistakes and to offer a public apology. "I've made a lot of mistakes," Carter began, his voice steady though his hands shook slightly, "and I've hurt a lot of people. My actions in that courtroom were unacceptable, and I regret them deeply. But it wasn't just that moment that I need to answer for, it's my entire career. I've allowed my prejudice to cloud my judgment, and I've let that hatred shape who I became." The room was silent, the reporters watching him closely, waiting for the twist, the thing they could use to tear him down. But Carter didn't flinch. He didn't give them the soundbite they were expecting. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he continued, his eyes meeting the camera. "I'm not asking for sympathy, but what I am asking for is a chance to make things right. I'm committed to changing, to unlearning the hate that has consumed me for far too long, and I will spend the rest of my life working to rebuild the trust I've lost." There was a long pause, and then, for the first time in months, Carter's shoulders seemed to relax. The weight he had been carrying, his guilt, his fear, seemed to lift just a little. It wasn't gone, but it was no longer crushing him. Kennedy stood at the back of the room watching with quiet approval. Carter wasn't asking for an easy way out. He wasn't trying to spin the situation into something he could control. He was finally taking responsibility. The reporters were slow to react at first, unsure of how to handle a man who had just bared his soul in front of them. But then one by one they started asking questions, not to tear him down but to understand his path forward. The narrative had shifted. This wasn't a story about a racist cop falling from grace. This was a story about redemption, about the possibility of change, even in the most unlikely of people. As the press conference ended, Kennedy approached Carter, his eyes filled with a quiet pride. The detective looked different, more human, more vulnerable. There was no bravado in his posture anymore, no hint of the anger that had once defined him. "You did it, Carter," Kennedy said, his voice soft but full of conviction. "You took the hardest step. Now the real work begins." Carter nodded, his face worn but determined. "I know I've got a lot of work to do, but I'm ready. I don't want to be the man I was. I want to be better." A few weeks later, Carter was officially reinstated into the police department, but he was a different man than the one who had been suspended. He had spent his time in between working with counselors, attending sensitivity training, and volunteering with community programs that aimed to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the citizens they were meant to protect. He wasn't pretending to be perfect. He wasn't asking for a free pass. He was simply doing the work. Meanwhile, Kennedy's political career continued to thrive, but he knew that this was the moment that mattered most. It wasn't the speeches he gave or the laws he passed, it was the impact he had on someone's life. Carter had made the choice to change, and Kennedy had been there to help him, but it was Carter's decision alone. That was what made this victory so meaningful. At the launch of the Clara Thibodeau Music Foundation, a cause Kennedy had been championing in honor of his childhood music teacher, he shared a story about redemption. It wasn't just about music, it was about the power of second chances, the belief that people could change if they were willing to do the hard work. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes briefly meeting Carter's in the back. The detective had come a long way, and though there was still a long road ahead, Kennedy knew that Carter had taken the first step. Redemption is not a destination, it's a journey. It requires acknowledging one's flaws, facing the consequences of past actions, and committing to growth. Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are against our own prejudices, our own hatred. But the power to change is always within us if we choose to take responsibility for who we are and who we want to become. If this story of redemption, courage, and second chances moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a moment that changed you? Let's continue the conversation. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire and challenge the status quo.